Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing this morning? Okay, did we get in a good enough stretch out? So it's nice to meet you all. I know I've had the pleasure of working with some of you all in this room. So just to introduce myself, so I work for the law firm, but I'm not an attorney. I have worked in school districts now for a little over 12 years, joined the firm about a year ago as a school finance and operations advisor and specialist. So I advise our school clients on anything related to finance, operations, compliance, grants, purchasing, all that fun stuff. So I've done some work, like I said, I've done some work with some of you all, so it's nice to see some familiar faces. And the goal of today is going to be to just try to do an overview of school finance. I know a lot of you as board members and even as superintendents, but especially the board members, right? You're volunteering, so you don't always come with that background in school finance, much less charter school finance. So we wanted to just take a step back and kind of from the board perspective, just give an overview of what we should know and be on the lookout for to help y'all ask the right questions when you're at your board meetings, getting presentations from your finance folks and your internal teams just to help, lay some of that groundwork. So if any questions come up, feel free to pause me and we'll go from there. Good? Okay, so I'm going to start with going over some basics of charter school funding, and then we'll move into some of the common funding requirements that kind of help impact what funding we receive and how we're able to keep it, and if we get any sanctions, all of that from TEA. So we'll go over student attendance accounting at a high level. We already talked a little bit about this morning, our fiduciary duties related to the organization. We'll talk about a little bit more as it relates to the use of state and federal funding. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the accounting for public and other funds. I think that's an issue that's come about for a lot of our charter school clients in terms of making sure our accounting compliance is appropriate and accurate and meets compliance requirements for TEA and our audits. Then we'll go into a little bit about federal funds, property management, grants management, purchasing, and contracts. Some of those we'll try to breeze through a little bit, right, because some of you all won't do the day-to-day on those things. And I know we're also trying to finish a little bit earlier for lunch. But like I said, if questions come up, and then you'll get all of these slides as well from Mr. Palagonia. So if anything comes up, let me know. Okay, so how many of us are familiar with how charter schools get their funding? Everybody? All right, so just at a high level, right, charter schools receive their funding from the Foundation School Program, right, FSP funding, based on our average daily attendance, right? Yeah, the FSP funding is broken into three categories. So we have operations, facilities, which charter schools now are eligible for some of that. We didn't used to be, and other programs. After that, right, TEA does have a lot of formula grants and even competitive funding that exists. I know some charter schools apply for some of that competitive funding. Then we have our federal funding and our entitlements. You'll hear that word a lot, entitlements. That's referring to like your Title I, your Title II, Title III, right? Those are entitlement funds. Then we have some charter school networks and some that don't, so I wanted to bring it up as well, that receive philanthropy and external grants. Right, so whether you have a local funder that is supporting the charter school mission, or you have a local nonprofit that wants to support your school, those types of things. Those are still important because oftentimes those still come with reporting requirements, compliance requirements, how we track it in our county records, et cetera. Right, and then just note up there, right, not as a surprise, but unlike ISDs, as charter schools, we do not receive funds through a local property tax revenue, right? One note there that I just want to point out because it's become apparent this year, right? As charter schools have struggled with enrollment, right? Post-COVID, coming back from that, we've seen a lot of charter schools that have lost enrollments. Either students that are choosing to stay at home, students that have chosen to go back to their ISD for whatever reasons. Charter schools have gotten that hit hard, right? You take that enrollment hit, your revenue's gone down. Pointing that out because this past year, ISDs did not experience the same kind of hit. Even if they had a loss of enrollment because property values went up, most of those districts didn't lose anything. Some of them even received more money. So this past year, ISDs really didn't have a hit in that regard. Charter schools definitely did. So all the more reason why it's very important that we pay attention to the finance, the compliance of it, et cetera. ISDs will probably see the hit next year. So I think with the legislature that's passed, they're going to be doing, have anyone heard the term recapture from the ISD side? So they are going to be doing some adjustments to the recapture formulas for next year that ISDs will probably see that hit going into next year, but obviously that doesn't impact you all. But I think that's an important note to make, because when you're having conversations with your colleagues that might work in ISDs, they did not experience the same hits that charter schools have had as it relates to reduced budgets and trying to do more with less, and how do we make this work when we've lost so much money with this enrollment drop. All the more reason that I've given some advice to school clients now about, even if you haven't in the past done any philanthropy or grant funding or anything like that, now's probably the time to do so, right? We don't know when enrollment will stabilize, if it's going to ever go back up to what it used to be. We don't know. So if that's never been on the top of mind in terms of having someone that does development for your school, that applies for grants, whether we're looking into some of the TEA, other competitive grants that they have, now's the time we probably should be doing that if we aren't already. So just some things to point out there. Okay, so just to go back to FSP funding, right? So FSP's got the two main components, the operations. We've got Tier 1. That's where we get most of our money, is in Tier 1. So if you ever hear that term of Tier 1 or Tier 2, Tier 1 is where we get most of our money. Tier 2, that's where ISDs usually get their property tax revenue, right? We get some money there because we don't receive that revenue. The state does some averages, and charter schools get some money in Tier 2, but not nearly what we see in Tier 1. Pointing this out, that even though you all wouldn't be the one to do this state aid template, that there is a state aid template that exists for schools to be able to estimate what their FSP payments will be. And I point this out because you can use this template really at any time throughout the year. So if we're ever experiencing enrollment changes, even just cyclically over the course of a school year, fiscal year, we can go back into the state aid template and be able to adjust and make sure, right? Or similarly, right, at this point now, we're guessing what we think ADA is going to be, right, for next school year. But then let's say now we're in September, October, and now we have a better idea of what it's at least looking like. Go back in, do this again. Constantly want to be doing it to make sure that from a budget perspective, we're staying on track and not stepping on our own toes and getting ourselves into trouble because we had an incorrect estimate of what we thought ADA was going to be. That's happened a lot. And not to anyone's fault. That's just the nature of, we're trying to estimate here, but we really don't know where we're going to end up, especially still coming off of these post-COVID years and trying. I know a lot of charter schools are doing a lot of marketing and recruitment, trying to get that enrollment back up, right? So we don't know where we're going to be. So that's why this state aid template is important, because you can use it at any time to try to update those numbers and kind of guess where we're going to be at any given time. There will be a new one coming out, I think it's next month, July, for the 23-24 school year. And I know that Tony's also asked, I think there's some superintendents that have asked for training on how to use that template, and I know some of you all have various finance staff on board. So if that's something that you're considering or wanting, you can definitely reach out to Tony, and he'll probably maybe work with us or other consultants to try to see how to get some support on how to use it, how to navigate it. So state special allotments. Wanted to go over this just at a high level because this is one too where a lot of schools tend to be out of compliance, not necessarily because they're not using the money in the right way, but because they're not accounting for it in the right way. So making sure that we know these exist and the requirements that we have in order to spend that money on a regular basis. So these are the most of the special allotments we receive, right? So we know that we get weighted money for special ed, state comp ed, all of those things, right? That's not necessarily new information. But we do have requirements annually that we have to meet minimum expenditure thresholds that money goes right. We can prove that money has gone back into that program. And the way that we do that is through accounting. So we'll go over that a little bit further, but wanted to point those out here, right? So for special ed, the requirement is that 55% of the money we get through FSP for special ed directly goes back into special ed. Some of these you'll see, GT, dyslexia, early ed, 100% of what we receive for those programs have to go back to those programs. So this is important when it comes to accounting. And I just want to point that out because I think a lot of districts are out of compliance technically. Again, not to say that they're not spending what they're supposed to or not doing what they're not supposed to do for students, but just because then when it comes to an accounting perspective, we're not accounting for it in the right way. And I'll tell you, right, when I used to work in school districts, this happened all the time. I worked in the finance office, right? So we would be reviewing the general ledger at the end of the year, trying to move stuff into special ed. And we'd be reviewing the general ledger, because let's say we were at 45%, right? We have to be at that 55%. So we'd be reviewing the general ledger, trying to see what we could move in. But if we're not the ones that are on the campus in the school, we don't necessarily know how the stuff's being utilized. So yesterday when we trained the principals, we also went through some of this with the principals and some of the basic account coding to help them better understand as well how they can help in the process. And it all goes back to what are we putting in our descriptions when we're writing purchase orders, putting in purchase orders, putting in invoices. That goes a long way. Versus like when I'm looking at the general ledger and I just see books, no idea. Cool, we know it's for students, but I have no idea if it's for special ed, if it's for state comp ed, for bilingual, no idea. So just point that out again as an accountability thing and making sure that we can all support to help be in better compliance with these areas. Grant funding, as I mentioned, right? So charter schools, if you're a new school, oftentimes they're getting CSP money through TEA. Oftentimes also if you're expanding or replicating, there's also some CSP opportunities for that you can apply for. Then we've got our formula grants and entitlements, right? So now we have our newer school safety grants for all of the legislative stuff we need to meet now for school safety. Everyone's familiar with the COVID and ESSER money we had, right? So we have that. Then we have our ESSA grants. We have our special ed, Perkins. And then also wanting to point out this, when you guys get this from Tony, you'll have the link to this TEA grant opportunities. But this page is important too because any of the other competitive grants that TEA has that's not one of the formula or entitlement grants would be included on this page. So again, in terms of advice, if we're in a spot where we've lost revenue, we've lost students, we're trying to figure out ways we can increase revenue, provide more services, that would be a good place to start. If you're looking for more grant opportunities, more funding to bring into your school, other ways you could do fundraising, philanthropy, this would be a place that I would suggest we have somebody start at your school. Okay, are there any questions on that piece before I move into funding requirements? No? Okay. So student attendance counting. I'm not going to go too much on the weeds on this, right, because you're not the ones that are in the classroom doing attendance, but making sure that we know why it's so important, right? So our state funding system, right, is based off our enrollment, our demographics, our attendance, and then our calendar, right, our days of instruction, our minutes of operation. Charter schools have to submit data through the FSP system and through PEIMS. Right, so FSP system is used for interim estimates. So has anyone ever heard the term of the 6 weeks attendance reporting? Right? That's where that comes from. Luckily for charters, this is a difference than for ISDs. Luckily for charters, when we do our 6 weeks attendance reporting, it updates our FSP estimates more times throughout the fiscal year than it does ISDs. ISDs are way lagged from the year before. So then if everyone's ever heard the term of settle up, has anyone heard that term? Settle up. So at the end of a fiscal year, TEA does a process that they call settle up. And that's where they take all of your final attendance data and they figure out like what your final payment is for your FSP. For charters, luckily, because we do those 6 weeks attendance reportings and they update that more regularly, we don't really see too large of a change. That's why that state aid template too is helpful to use throughout the year because we don't see that much of a change. Whereas ISDs sometimes do because they go through the whole year before TEA really does a more formal settle up process for them. And then through PEMS, like I said, that's where they do the final settlement of our FSP for the year. So the Student Attendance Accounting Handbook, that has all of the audit requirements related to accounting, student coding, all of that. Again, not going to go into the weeds on this part. The point that I want to point out here is just, again, how it's so important and sometimes how we don't realize the impact of this until later. So we've had some clients recently that have had some small, some large, where they've miscoded students and they didn't follow the right requirements. We've had one client that's now having to pay back $2,000 to TEA for some minor coding adjustments to students that had to get made. And then we've had other clients that have had upwards of $400,000 that they're having to repay back to the agency. And they're not finding this out until the next year, sometimes even after, right? We know TEA is not super fast in how they're reviewing information, right? So just pointing out about how important this is to make sure we're getting our student coding done right, we're making sure the attendance information comes down right. And we'll go a little bit later into internal controls and why that's important in setting the tone. And from that perspective, that's why it's important for board members, superintendents, that we're setting the right tone of how important all of this is to make sure we stay in compliance. So again, I know Dr. C talked about our fiduciary duties earlier, so I'm not going to go too much into that, right? But we all know as board members, superintendents, CEOs, that we are considered officers and fiduciaries to our schools, right? We talked about our duty of obedience, duty of care, duty of loyalty, all of that, right? So as board members, making sure that we're adopting policies that conform to law, that incorporate best and common practices, that we're making sure our administrative procedures now from a CEO superintendent standpoint, right, that we're making sure we align our procedures to our board policies, that we're addressing legal requirements, we're providing step-by-step process and instructions, we're providing standardized forms, we're monitoring our practices throughout the year, and we're identifying and addressing lapses, right? Those are ways we can help address some of this. So some of this kind of goes back to, we've heard from some clients where they're receiving regular updates, right, from their finance folks on a monthly basis, and they're trusting that it's right? If you're trusting your employee, right, just as Dr. C said, your employee is the CEO superintendent, and then their employees are everybody else. So to a certain degree, we want to be able to trust those people, but at the same time, we want to be able to equip you to know what questions should we be asking, what information are we looking for, how can we identify and address the lapses, right? So that way we can help navigate that as well. Okay, so we're going to move into accounting for public and other funds, right? So how can public funds be used? And in this sense, we're talking about like our FSP payment, our FSP funds, state funds, et cetera. For the benefit of the students, that's easy. Student-based allotments, we talked about those, right? The ones that have the prescribed levels of how we're supposed to spend them. We know federal funds are subject to additional requirements. They must be expended and authorized by the board in the adopted budget, as amended and in policy. I want to point this out because we've seen a lot of instances lately too where we do our budget, right? You guys are all familiar with approving your budget before the fiscal year, but then what we're not doing is making sure that we're reviewing that budget regularly and then making sure all of the amendments are done appropriately before the fiscal year ends. So we've had some clients then that are coming back on the tail end from TEA and getting requests for information because they have too many variances in their budget, right? And at that point, when your fiscal year is done, we can't change anything anymore. So just making sure that, and maybe it's just setting some parameters and protocols so that the board's going to make sure we're going to do formal reviews of the budget at least 3 times during the fiscal year. Make sure we ask for that from your finance folks, that we're reviewing the budget at least 3 times a year would be what I would recommend. And making sure that it gets approved and amended as necessary before your fiscal year ends. And then some charters, right, are operated through a charter holder that's not a charter organization, right? So making sure from that perspective that we're not using public funds for non-charter or out-of-state activities. So we've got some clients that we have agreements with where they have to make sure they're separating out, right, non-charter, charter activities. So some of you are in that boat, not all. So public funds considerations, right? Again, social activities, if it's not something that's benefiting the students, we don't want to do that, keeping in mind our fiduciary duties. Making sure that our records, this goes back to, from a finance perspective, this goes back to accounting, the records, all of that, making sure that it's consistent, complete, accurate, all of that. No commingling. Right? So again, if you have related entities that are not the charter school, making sure we have no commingling of any of the funds that are designed for the charter school with anything that's not for the charter school. Interested party transactions. So some of you may know that. So interested party would be you as board members, superintendents, principals, all of that, and any transactions that you have with the school throughout a fiscal year. So we're required as schools, for example, one of them is to report out any transactions we have with a board member throughout the fiscal year. And that's just to help make sure that any transaction we've had with a board member, right, has no apparent conflict of interest that we've had with the school. Related party transactions, that would be similar, and that kind of goes to that relationship base, right? So if you're a board member and you have a printing shop and you want the school to do business with your printing shop, right? Well, number one, from the conflict of interest standpoint, you've removed yourself from that. But then they also want they want to be able to see any transactions related to it, so that way we can prove that we had no conflict of interest in that, right? Or again, if you have part of your organization is not related to the charter and you have property or you have other things, they want to see those related party transactions, and we're required to report them through our audit. We've talked about conflict of interest, so we won't need to go in there. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time. Like I said, we've seen some issues lately about just accounting, right, and our compliance with accounting. So I want to just go over some of the basics of charter school accounting. Try to keep it high level as much as possible, okay? So financial accounting and reporting for charter schools must comply with, they call it the FASREG. Have we all heard that term before? FASREG? So that's the Financial Accountability System Resource Guide. All of your finance folks should know it relatively well, like the palm of their hand, hopefully. If they don't, that's one of those areas where you, as board members or superintendents, should push to make sure that your staff knows the FASREG. They need to know the FASREG. And there's 2 modules that are specific to charter schools within the FASREG, Module 2 and Module 3, specific to charter schools. We must also comply with GAAP. And we also must comply with our financial accountability, right? So charter first, we must comply with. That's also come up a lot in recent years, right? We've had some schools that have failed charter first. We've had some schools that have, missed points. We've had a lot of issues with COVID, right? A lot of the indicators right now that have existed, we've been impacted by from COVID, right? How well we can estimate our ADA has been hard for everybody. So TEA has made some accommodations over the years to try to accommodate so we're not all failing charter first because of these COVID-related issues, right? As we know, there's 2 options for our fiscal year period. So some charter schools have a July 1 start. Some charter schools have a September 1 start. Just making sure everyone's aware of what our fiscal year is important. Also, it's important to be cognizant that grant year periods differ. And that's important too, to just know like when your Title I grant ends, when your ESSER grants were ending. All of those are important because those do not fall in line necessarily with your fiscal year or anything. But it's important because all of those grant funds have to be used in the grant period that you're allowed to use that money in. So just to be cognizant of that, right? So most of the grants that we get don't fall in line easily with our fiscal years, right? Those ESSER funds were 2-3 year periods and all of that. We had some schools that were trying to sign contracts that were going beyond the period, right? You can't sign a contract that's going to go beyond a grant period. So making sure we're cognizant, right? And in that case, that's important because a lot of times these large contracts have to come to the board for approval, right? So being cognizant of, how are we buying whatever it is that's in this contract? If it's a grant, what's the grant period on this contract? Are we allowed to obligate ourselves to sign this contract? If it's outside of a grant period, the answer is no. And so that's just another way to try to help, make sure that we're doing our due diligence and making sure we're not getting ourselves into trouble down the road. Okay, so Charter First. How familiar are we with Charter First? Too familiar? So they had some new rules that were just adopted as of June 6th. They didn't make too many changes, except they did clarify what the pandemic-related adjustments are going to be for 22-23. So this will be, they're going to be issuing a rating pretty soon, probably in August, but it will be based on your fiscal year 22. So not the fiscal year that's either ended or just ended. Does that make sense? It's going to be based off your fiscal year 22. But as part of that process, all school districts will pass Indicator 5. All charter schools will be awarded the maximum points for Indicator 10, which Indicator 10 is did the charter school average less than a 10% variance when comparing budgeted revenues to actual revenues for the last 3 fiscal years, right? That's hard for anyone to meet in the most recent fiscal year time, right? With COVID, with not knowing how everything was going to lay out, it's been hard to estimate what you think your revenues are going to be. So for that reason, for this rating period, charter schools will get the maximum points for that. It's not going to be scored. That's not to say we don't know yet how it will be for FY23. We'll know next year if TEA will score it or not. So this will be your 22-23 rating, but it's going to be based off FY22. Charter schools will also get maximum points for Indicator 16, which was the charter school's actual ADA within 10% of the school's annual estimated ADA. So that helps us, right? We're going to, no matter what that comes out to be, we'll get maximum points for it. For Indicator 14, which is our admin cost ratio, they actually did this last year, but they just didn't have it in the official rules. But officially now in the official rules, they're going to add in all of the ESSER funds into that, which helps us. So that's a good thing. They're going to add in the ESSER funds to help us in terms of calculating our admin cost ratio. And we will get awarded the maximum points for Indicator 15, which is whether or not did the charter school not have a 15% decline in the student to staff ratio over 3 years, right? So a lot of that has related to, we kept staff, right, in a lot of cases for COVID. So that helps us there. And yeah, I think those are them. So again, it will help us in a lot of these areas. They did also make a change, which is helpful. So we actually worked on several appeals for clients where on Indicator 1, which hopefully not a lot of schools fail Indicator 1, but that's the one that's just, did you submit your audit on time to TEA? Surprisingly, we actually had several folks that failed that indicator for various reasons, like either their computer system timed out or they didn't get the email from TEA saying it got submitted, or the staff was out of country or something. So we actually worked with TPCSA to try to help address some of these indicators. And they didn't change it entirely, except they still would require a school to do an appeal if that happens, if they fail Indicator 1. But if they do an appeal and they can show that the board certification was done and the audit letter was done on time, that you can come back and get awarded for that credit. Like let's say it was just an administrative error, like something happened in getting it submitted in the TEAL system, because the TEAL audit system is very old and antiquated. I wouldn't be surprised. If that's the only reason that you did not submit everything on time, then you can come back during an appeal process and get credit for that and not still fail. That's been the history, was that you would still fail even if we tried to appeal, if the administrative was the only error that we had. So we had some wins in there. We had some that we were hoping to get and we didn't, but we'll keep working at it. So linked in the spreadsheet or in the PowerPoint when you also get it, there's links to the updated rules and to the revised worksheet. So if you guys want to reference those. I will say separately, just as a heads up, so we have done us at the firm, we've done some Charter First calculations for some of our clients now that have asked for support and help on doing that, trying to work with your finance folks and kind of estimate what we think your score might be. So if anyone needs support or help in doing that, we could help support in that way too. This is just to say there was no changes to any of these other indicators. We talked about the changes that were made. Okay, so again, right, because accounting compliance has been an issue we've seen a lot lately, wanted to just go over at a high level accounting. Is anyone in here familiar with what this looks like? Yeah? Do we know what it means? What all of these mean? Okay, so don't worry, as board members and even as superintendents, I don't expect everyone in this room to know what all of these mean. There's a lot of things in here. But there are certain things that we can know and be knowledgeable of that can help us, right? So again, if you're getting presented information in a board meeting and you're being told, this is where we're at, or you're seeing financial reports, draft financial reports that list out function codes, right? This will help you know what they mean. Right? So knowing where these come from, how they incorporate into our budget, how they incorporate into our general ledger and our financial reporting, all it can do is help you, right? Just having the knowledge, all it can do is help you. So I'm just going to go over a few of these. This is the base structure from TEA that's listed in the FASREG. There are some local codes. Let's see if I can do this little thingy. Like this is a local code here. These are local codes. So these local codes can be decided on a case-by-case basis locally, right? So there's some schools that choose to utilize these codes and some schools that don't, and those are at the discretion of the district. Then there's codes that we have to use. So I'm going to go over some of these that we have to use. So the first code is called the fund code. So when you're reviewing reports, just so we have a basic understanding of what we're looking at in terms of where this is coming from, right? The fund code is a required 3-digit code used to identify the fund group and the specific fund. So common fund codes that we see in the charter school space, Fund 420. Are we familiar with that? 420? That's our FSP funding. Sometimes we get confused because for an ISD, it's 199. But for a charter school, it's 420. That's where you're going to see most of your money, right? So it's important we know that that's what it means, 420. So that's our state money. Then these are our most frequent federal funds that charter schools get, right? And these aren't all the funds, right? If you get other grants from TEA or you get other private grants or you get anything else, those are going to be in other funds. And the FASREG helps delineate where those go. But Title I is 211, IDEA B 224, IDEA B preschool 225, child nutrition 240, Title II 255, CSP 258, Title III 263, right? Just some of the most common fund codes that we see. But again, it's just important to know that when you're reviewing financial information, just having a basic idea, like where are we getting our money from? How are we spending it? It's all important. So function codes. Maybe you all are familiar with seeing these because they're oftentimes on some of those summary financial reports, right? Financial statements that we have. These are the most common function codes that we see for charter schools, and this just helps us better understand the purpose of a transaction. And again, this is also just important to know so you know what they are as you're asking questions, and if we need to determine if we need to do a budget amendment or not throughout any given year. We have restrictions on like how much we can move within these function codes before a budget amendment is required, right? So again, that's why it's important to know what these mean and to be able to ask right questions. So these are just the common ones. You'll get them in the PowerPoint. Object codes. These are the next set of codes. There's 4 numbers in here. Required 4-digit code used to identify the purpose of an account, a transaction, or a source of funding. And there's different categories. If the object code starts with a 1, those are our assets and other debits. This is particularly important. We've seen it a lot coming up on like, what's our day's cash on hand, right? That's in Charter First. You'll see that in your 1100s. Anything that starts with the 2 are liabilities. Anything that starts with a 3 is net assets. Anything that starts with a 5, those are all your revenue accounts. Anything that starts with a 6, those are all of our expenses. So what's actually being spent in the school. And then 7 are our gains in net assets released from restrictions. 8, any losses in net assets released from temporary restrictions. Those get a little bit more confusing, but again, at least so you know at a high level of if it starts with a 1 or 2 or 3, what does that mean, right? Or if we're wanting to know how much money have we gotten from TEA, well, we should see it in an account that starts with a 5, right? So just kind of understanding the basics of how this works and operates, so that way you can ask the right questions and push and help be in compliance. Okay, so we went over this yesterday with the principals, but for them, right, they're not the business office, they're not the finance folks, they're not doing that high-level financial accounting, but for them, what's important to know, right, is they're the ones that are actually spending the money, right? So for them, it's particularly important that they know the expense codes, right? And I said all the expenses, right, started with the 6. Anything that's an expense starts with the 6. From here, we've got anything that starts with the 6100 is payroll. Anything that starts with 6200 is contracted services. Anything that starts with 6300 is supplies and materials. 6400 other operating, 6500 debt. Okay, just super basic, high level. So the other important one is program intent codes. Now we're over here towards the end a little bit, but these are important, especially as it relates to those state special allotments I told you about. Right? These are 2-digit codes used to designate the intent of a program provided to students. Right? So again, if we're talking about our state funding that we got from special ed, if we're using it on special ed, we want to see it in PIC 23. If we're using it on bilingual, we want to see it in PIC 25. And again, this just helps us be able to better account for how we're spending our money, be able to meet these state special allotments we have to meet, making sure we're in compliance. There's some additional accounting rules that follow in there, and they help us checks and balances in there. So for example, if we have a function code 11, which is just instruction, we should never see a PIC 99, because that says that's undistributed. That is essentially saying it's not for students, right? So we would never see a function 11 with a PIC 99. So we've got some rules in there too, but just again, high level of knowing what these are, what they mean, making sure we stay in compliance with those state special allotments. This is also an important code to know. So the other codes in there, again, those we're not going to go into detail on those. I think those are less important to know intimately in the back of your head, but we have our org codes. Those usually help us distinguish between if we're talking about a particular campus or a particular office, if we're talking about the superintendent's office, things like that. Then we have our fiscal year code. That just identifies the fiscal year we're in. Then, like I said, there's those local option codes, and those will depend on your districts on how that's been set up. Right? Sometimes we see them set up as sub-object codes, project codes. Oftentimes we see that with different grants. Right, so usually with Title I, for example, you might have for a short period of time, you'll have 2. Right? Or if you've got your ESSER grants, right, we've got ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3. Now those have different funds, but if they didn't, a project code could be a way you would distinguish them and be able to account for them separately. But again, those are local option codes. Okay, so we're going to switch gears now. Is there any questions on that piece? The accounting piece? Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. Was it? I know, it's a lot of numbers. It's for those of us that do that work, there's way more to it, but again, just trying to make sure that we understand the basics of it, I think is important for the board to know. So standards for financial and program management of federal funds, right? Again, just making sure that we're accurately identifying all of our federal awards, that we have reporting of it separately, accurately, that we have control over it. Are we spending it in the right ways? Making sure that we're comparing our budget to actuals in those ways, making sure we have procedures for cash management and procedures for determining allowability of costs. So that could just even include just reviewing our processes and procedures of how, if someone wants to spend Title I, how do they go about getting that approved before they actually go and spend? Auditors will want to see what's our procedures for determining allowability of costs. So I mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about internal controls. We could have a whole separate conversation about internal controls, but I'm going to try to just truncate it down a little bit, right? So it's prescribed from federal funding perspective that we have to have a system of internal controls, but really we should have it regardless. It really shouldn't matter whether or not we receive federal funds or not. But that's just the environment that we've set up to help reduce and mitigate risk for how we are, not only as it relates to money, but even just generally as we have internal controls over student safety. You can have anything that we do as a school, we want to have proper internal controls. So it's not just finance. But the components of an internal control system are control environment, so that's the culture and tone of the organization. As board members of a charter school, you are the ones ultimately leading the charge on setting that tone, the culture and tone of how we are going to address internal controls for the organization and how we approach compliance. Second component is a risk assessment. So what are our high areas of risk and what needs more effort in our organization, right? That might depend. That's a conversation you have with your board and your superintendent, but what are the areas of high risk for the organization? Third component is control activities. This is what people often think it means to have internal controls, which is a large part of it. But control activities are the actual policies and procedures you have in place to be in compliance with various things, right? It could be finance, could be your attendance accounting, could be student safety, student discipline, right? All those things we've talked about. Our control activities are all the policies and procedures we have in place to be in compliance with these different areas. Then we have our information and communication. That includes what training are we doing with our staff to make sure that they're following the internal control system that we're setting up for the organization, and how consistent are we being in implementing the policies and procedures we've adopted. And then monitoring. So that's important, right? We see turnover all the time in the charter school space, especially on the business side. I know from experience. You see a lot of turnover in that space. So how are we monitoring what we're doing? How are we monitoring changes in laws, regulations, making sure we're updating things we need to do? So internal control requirements. At a high level, we need to have board policies, right? Written administrative and management procedures, standardized forms and templates, records that show the above in practice. So you'll hear this time and time again about how important documentation is, right? From an audit perspective, if they can't see the record, didn't exist, didn't happen, right? So making sure we have the records that show all these things in practice. And then again, the continuous monitoring improvement of policies and practices. Oftentimes you see this in play for charter schools, especially as they're growing in staff, as they're reducing in staff. How are we making the adjustments to how we're operating, how we have our separation of duties, how we're making things work and fit? That's critical for us in the charter school space, right? I know some schools have made some difficult decisions about reducing staff sizes. We've got others that are growing. It's constant. So we always need to be monitoring what we're doing, how we're operating, making sure it's still effective and efficient. Right, so I often get asked the question of does TEA have a resource for me, what it means to have good internal controls? No, it doesn't exist, and it never will exist, because it depends. The framework and the idea of what it means, that's there. But what it actually looks like for your school and your district depends greatly. These are some of the factors that influence that, right? How old, how big, how small, what sources are we outsourcing? Is payroll in-house? Are we outsourcing that somewhere else? Some of it might also be what % of restricted funds you're getting, right? If a good portion of your budget is federal funds or restricted funds, you might tend to have a little tighter internal controls than you might if you're just using your state funds. The board risk tolerance, that's a big one. right? We've got some people just naturally as human beings that are more risk averse, and then some people that are willing to take more risk. And again, because in the charter school space where we're volunteering, that plays a huge part into how we operate as a charter school. Is that board voice, that board tone of how we're going to operate, I think that makes a big difference. We also have risk levels with TEA. And depending on that risk level, we might also sway in one direction or the other about how we're going to operate our internal controls. And then just if you do your own organizational risk assessment. So really there's no right way, wrong way. There's no way to tell you how to operate internal controls. It's an ongoing conversation. And I'll tell you, for example, if your business office staff is 2 people versus if your business office staff is 15 people, right? You're going to have very different ways of operating. That's just natural. So if you only have a staff of 2, how do we make sure we have the right separation of duties and making sure that we're approving things appropriately, right? It's very hard. It's very hard. So that internal control system will look very different than if you have a staff of 15. No 2 districts will look the same. So just making sure that everyone knows that that's just the nature of it, right? That's the reality. But if you ever need help or support, you can always come to us. You can lean on each other, talk about it, figure out how we operate in that space. So again, just at a high level, the roles in the internal control system, like I said, we've talked about it a few times, but as board members, right, you're responsible for the overall direction and accountability obligations, and then it bleeds down to the bottom, right? So some common breakdowns of internal controls. So again, if our culture and tone doesn't prioritize it, or we override it. So we've seen a lot of cases where they'll have a travel policy, that might say something like, no one can travel and spend more than $500 on a flight. But then we see transactions in the general ledger, we've got $800 flights. Just because. Or it was the superintendent, so we gave him a pass because it was the superintendent. Whatever the case might be, the minute that we start allowing exceptions to our policies and not following them, that's a breakdown of internal controls. So making sure we're consistent and following what we're setting in place. Also, right, when an auditor comes in, that's the first thing they're going to ask you for, right, is your policies and procedures. And they're going to try to see, are you following what you're saying you're doing? So I'll give an example of procurement, right? So for procurement, charter schools have flexibility, right? We don't really have to follow too terribly much like an ISD does for the 50,000 mark. But let's say in your local policy, you said you were going to follow that. So if an auditor comes in and we've decided, no, we're going to scrap it. We're not going to do that. But we said in our local policies that we were, well, now we're in trouble because we said we were going to do this and we're not doing it. So that's why it's important to make sure that we're actually doing what's in our written policies and procedures. Other breakdowns, using public funds for personal gain, using revenues for non-charter activities, lack of documentation, big one. We see that a lot. So again, even if we're doing all the right things, if we don't have them documented well, we're going to get ourselves into trouble. Lack of training and human error. We see this a lot, right? Where it's like we're violating our own policies and procedures, but the person who made the error was never properly trained on how to do X, Y, Z. So making sure we're doing that. Staff turnover, staff capacity, organizational size, right? Goes back to the 2 business staff versus 15. Just natural limitations to be able to operate it. And cost constraints, right? Charter schools already have smaller budgets than ISDs, and you hear about all these fancy systems sometimes that can operate, all this stuff fantastically, but they cost way too much money. So how can we operate and still have effective internal controls if we can't afford this $80,000 software? All of these are factors we have to consider. This is just a list of all of the things we're required to have documented policies and procedures from a federal perspective. So you'll get this list. This kind of moves into our grants and the cost principles. But again, just making sure that our costs are allowable for the grant that we're using, They're consistent with our policies and procedures. They're incurred in the budget period, right? Property standards, this just helps us make sure, right? For federal funds, we know we're supposed to track them, inventory them. We know that. So this kind of goes into how we're supposed to use them, dispose of them, all of that. Sometimes this comes up more so, like let's say we bought a whole lab full of computers with Title I, just as an example, right? That grant's now over, it was over 3 years ago. Now you want to use those computers for bilingual. You can, but we're supposed to document that now we're going to release these computers from Title I, and now we want to use them for bilingual. Again, documentation. So there's rules around property transition, property disposition, all of these things, but they require documentation. If we don't have it documented, then we're out of compliance. Grant management. I think some of this falls in line with stuff we've already been talking about, right? But making sure that, again, it's all allowable. It's part of the grant program. We're evaluating. We're doing a needs assessment. We're making sure we have a plan for how we want to use these funds. This also comes to play, just to point out, I guess, are you familiar with the term supplement, not supplant? Right? So we see this a lot just in terms of meeting fiscal compliance or maintenance of effort, right? Have we heard maintenance of effort? So managing those things can be a little bit tricky, so just making sure at a high level we know what our plan is to spend these monies and we can maintain it year over year. So supplement, not supplant, right? We're spending money and above and beyond what we would do as part of our normal program, and we're using Title I, for example, to pay for this. But if we use Title I this year, we can't then come and say, okay, well, next year I'm going to use 420. And then the next year come and say, oh, now I want to use Title I again. Can't do that. So it's just being mindful of some of these restrictions on these federal funds and making sure we properly plan to use them. Again, just making sure we address the whole life cycle of a grant. Grant mismanagement, I know we've talked about some of this already, but if we have weak internal controls, this can lead to either corrective actions from the agency, could lead to repayment or refunding unallowable or questioned costs, could lead to conditions on future grants. They might say, okay, we'll give you this grant, but now you have to do X, Y, Z, either additional reporting, additional compliance, et cetera. Or we could also get a higher risk level, right? So we have low, medium, and high risk. We don't want to be high risk. But all of those could lead to that. Purchasing contracts, right? We all know that because the way that we have procurement and purchasing impacts how we're actually spending our money. This just talks about why it's important. These talk about what we're required to meet for purchasing. Again, the bigger point here is maintaining effective internal controls and just making sure we have processes in place that show that we're operating procurement effectively, that we have procedures, it's in line with board policy, that we have oversight, things like that. Making sure that we know who can sign a contract for the organization. A lot of times there's confusion there. When can the board sign? Can a superintendent sign? If they can, when can they sign? Can a principal sign a contract? If so, when can they sign? So some of these things go into play when making sure we have appropriate signatory authority within the organization. Making sure we have standard terms and conditions, that we have processes in place for conflict of interest checks, criminal history checks, and that we have ongoing performance management of contracts. Are we satisfied with the vendors that we have? We're not just reapproving just because. Are we satisfied? How are we documenting? Those things like that.